in our interpretation, and no one knows the true interpretation but Allah. And the verse continues that for those that believe, they say, we believe in it, all is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and none will be reminded except those endowed with true intellect. So again, you have this verse talking about two types of people. And you'll see this psychology families, with ourselves first and foremost, in our Muslim spaces, in our MSAs, in our masajid. What might this psychology manifest as? Some people, in our gatherings of deliberation and discussion, you see they're always dialed into the major issues. People are not praying. Praying Jumu'ah in the United States is a rarity among Muslims. Praying 5 prayers is a rarity among Muslims. That's a big deal. Some people see that and focus on that while there's other things to focus on. All across the Muslim world, clearly a huge number of Muslims do not give their obligatory zakah, right? The requirement and the right of the poor in the wealth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given some of His servants. And that's an issue. You see people dialed in and talking about that when they could be talking about other things. The flight of Muslims leaving the religion and struggling with doubt and struggling with relationships and struggling with substance abuse. Obviously the opioid crisis is a huge issue, not only in the US, but especially here in North Carolina. What these people are not focusing on is arguing about the lighting and the carpet. And there's a story of a person that got bent out of shape over a person who hadn't been to the masjid for years because they were criticizing their clothing, which was proper clothing covering, but was of a more Western style instead of an Eastern style. This nitpicking and issues that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not make a priority is an indication of this problematic attitude, right? And sadly, in our conferences, in our gatherings, the very nature of the questions that come in these sessions, the types of things that people focus on are indicative of this problematic psychology. That we're not focused on what matters. We're not focused on the priorities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed in our deen. Now, differentiating this as a Muslim leader or as a Muslim community member, differentiating between lack of priority versus advice that you don't want to hear is very tricky. And I want to warn you, especially those of you that have responsibility in MSAs or schools, that there is a difference. Sometimes, for example, a certain MSA gathering, maybe things, some things didn't go as planned, and there was genuinely maybe some problem between the genders that's not according to our. And somebody comes up to you as an MSA Shura member, as a leader, and bring this to your attention. Now that person didn't go spread a fitna about it. They didn't talk to a random person. They talked to somebody with authority, and hopefully they're constructive in the manner that they're providing this feedback as well. You can't turn around and say, oh, no, you're not focused on the priorities, we should be praying and giving zakat. No, there's a difference here, because they're raising an issue with legitimate religious backing. And so as a parent, as a teacher, as a leader, that line between those two can be very blurry. And one of the important ways, in addition to seeking knowledge, that you're able to clarify that line is by having people around you that give you sincere advice. Why am I saying that? Because people that nitpick over nonsense and people that raise an issue that you missed or that's inconvenient, they can have a common feeling in that they're it can be a little bit discomforting. It can be a little bit, embarrassing. It can rub you the wrong way, but they're very different. One is rubbing you the wrong way just naturally because you weren't expecting it or didn't notice it, or maybe there's a little bit of hardship. And the other is rubbing you the wrong way maybe because it's not what we should be focused on. If it becomes about the ego, if it becomes about the self, then the two feel the same. You see what I'm saying? Both feel annoying. Both feel like a nuisance. So you have to have the discipline as a leader and a group around you that advises you to be able to tell the difference. The difference between advice or or direction or constructive criticism that is rooted in a legitimate religious argument and a legitimate point, versus things that are more personal, more grudge, more ego, more whatever, because one has to be paid attention to and the other can be, not given the same priority. With class with respect, but you don't have the same religious responsibility to give that the same level of attention. I want to share with you some advice, but first I want to engage each other in small groups, inshallah, in about 3 to 4 minutes. Thinking now in the context of the responsibilities that you have in life, as a brother and sister, as a community member, as a leader, as a teacher, as an individual Muslim first and foremost. What are some points of healthy advice that we can extract from this short but profound hadith that we could offer one another in these different things? Whatever touches your heart. If you feel like focusing more individually, focusing as a teacher, what are some practical pieces of advice that we offer one another from this hadith? So we'll take about 3 minutes, inshallah, to talk about that in small groups. Please go.
I saw you. Outplayed last night. I saw you downtown. I'm exposing that, I went making coffee. Just
even if I see or me that I'm going to
someone up here.
reading something like that, I can say, I don't think we should price or we're not sure whether.
What makes you doubtful?
Again, now I'm fairly good at doubt, and I've also created this dilemma here. You may be hungry and equal. Am I going to drive this person to a point where myself anything and everything that I don't want to put myself in? That's really what I'm saying. Well, I interpret this again. To the extent possible, if I can eliminate the doubt, I will. I'm not going to communicate. I'm not going to do every time. You know what? I want because I try to do that. And this is my dilemma to me, to anyone around me.
I don't really want to be doubtful, but I mean, there's always a risk that
I don't know how to answer that.
because that,
It's a very difficult topic.
Well, the doubtful part could be will she raise your kids? On the sideline say, oh, your dad is so good. You're wrong.
and I always question just be very fair.
Okay, inshallah, let's come back together. A lot of advice that can be derived from this hadith. I will focus on 2 and then inshallah can add any others that may have come up in your discussion. Again, this is hadith number 11. But one advice is that as a Muslim leader in Muslim spaces, when possible, it is wise to avoid issues of legitimate difference of opinion and division when you're able to. Now, what does that mean? There is a legitimate Islamic scholarly difference over Zabih Hamid, for example, right? And as an individual, making decisions for yourself, making decisions for your family, even if you're helping a young Muslim that's struggling, for example. There's a difference between a person that's struggling with alcohol or the bihamid, right? As a murabbi, as a mentor, if that person is struggling, then you know which one to prioritize, because there's no difference of opinion that alcohol is prohibited. At least there's space for discussion, the bihamid. But now remember, you have different responsibilities. So if you're not thinking about what meat am I consuming, if you're not thinking about an issue of mentorship, you're thinking as youth group leader, you're thinking as a host for a dinner, you're thinking as MSA Shura member, where should you land on that division? There's no question that it is much wiser to serve the bihamid at your gathering, because then you've encompassed everyone. You see what I'm saying? And sadly, how many needless and meaningless fights in an MSA occur over an issue like that, when you have a very easy, because there's a difference than thinking for yourself than thinking for a group or for a gathering. Similarly, a very important part of our activism in Muslim spaces is work in advocacy in social justice, and for some competent and strong people in our midst to engage politics. But again, what hat are you wearing? If you are organizing a youth group in a masjid or an MSA or whatever, a space that's not expressly engaged in that work, politics and partisan issues by their nature are highly divisive. And reasonable people can come to different conclusions on policy, right? So it is wise in these Muslim spaces to focus on issues of agreement, to focus on creating the space for discussion. For example, many masajid will host or invite candidates for office, equal opportunity, all political parties, to address the community. But they will not then advocate, lobby, or select a particular party or another. Again, there are some organizations, political action committees, whatever, that's fine, that's your work. Then people that come are expecting that. But in MSAs, youth groups, and masajid, it's very unwise to drive a wedge between Muslims on issues where there can be legitimate difference of opinion. Now, sometimes you have to put up with a lot of heat for an issue that's not divisive and that's very clear, and that's different. I'm not telling you to avoid heat or avoid controversy or avoid taking pressure where it's, well, let me just be a straight shooter. If we give a khutbah at IAR on mental health, on counseling, on abuse, I'm going to get a lot of heat that Friday and that weekend. And I'm telling you, as long as I draw breath and have strength, we will keep giving khutbah and keep talking about these issues. I don't care how much heat it brings. Why? Because this is an issue of clarity in our religion. We need to talk about and have difficult conversations, because our religion is not ambiguous about abuse. Our religion is not ambiguous about family rights. So that's different. But other policy issues, and most of what politicians talk about, are issues of legitimate difference. So we can have conversations based on the space about social justice issues, about issues that are very important, very relevant, but not issues of division. Again, I'm specifically talking about kind of Muslim spaces, while fully recognizing the importance of some organizations that are partisan, right? Or that are political action committee. That's fine, because they're labeled as that, and there's a space for that. But that's not what masajid or MSAs or schools or other similar organizations are, which are non-partisan by nature and apolitical. Another piece of advice that our scholars offer is that as a person charts their own path in seeking knowledge, what do we take out of this hadith? That our journey to knowledge should be founded on the big foundational matters of our religion. So our scholars throughout history used to always give precedence to the study of the Holy Quran before the study of other things. Why? Because this is a speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's the most honorable knowledge is the knowledge of Allah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prioritized certain things in His book and did not prioritize others. It's not because they're not importance, because they're less important. Similarly, particularly in learning Islamic disciplines such as Aqidah or Islamic creed or fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence and law, you should seek teachers who contextualize the tradition, right? And a big issue with how particularly many Western Muslims learn fiqh or learn Aqidah is that they learn history as a series of differences. Difference number one, difference number two, difference number three. So they walk out without a feeling for the subject. In reality, all the major four schools of thought and the vast majority of Islamic scholarship agree about a huge amount of stuff in terms of Aqidah and in terms of fiqh. The issues of difference are by very definition furu' and branch matters of religion. There's no problem if you hold an opinion passionately, if you learn, but you should learn also where there is space that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed purposefully, and a respectful and humble criticism of many people that are more knowledgeable and gifted. It's a criticism of methodology. I've dealt with a lot of young people that have been through 4 or 5 intensives on Aqidah, for example, and yet you ask them who is Allah, who is His Messenger, and why are you Muslim? They can't put 2 words together. This is an issue in methodology. That means that person has gathered a lot of facts, but they haven't learned properly the essence of Iman as communicated in Quran al-Kareem. Brothers and sisters that engage in endless debates on branch matters of fiqh, but you ask them, what are the requirements of prayer? Or what invalidates a prayer? This is a major issue in prioritization. If you don't know how to pray, but you know how to debate these branch matters, then you have not learned things in the right order. So another piece of advice, inshallah, look to build your own knowledge in a way that is respectful of the priorities of our deen. Inshallah, any quick questions or any additional pieces of advice that touched you that you'd like to share, inshallah, with the group before we move on.
You said something very early on today morning. It has to do with the matters of the heart. And one of the things that I struggle with is my heart telling me when I do something wrong? Is it always telling me that?
When a person is doing something.
Well, specifically me, because I think I cannot tell you what's in your heart.
So a person in general, as you look to take a barometer or temperature of your own heart, if you will, every believer, every human being is created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're born upon al-fitra. And al-fitra is the pure, uncorrupted human spirit that naturally inclines towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? This is our origin. Our origin is innately good. Our creation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with a part, a ruh, or the spirit or soul, that longs for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, longs for those elevation, and a body that also has needs to go through this dunya and desires to survive. And both are inextricably linked. As a person goes through life, that fitrah, that innate nature that they started with, is affected by their decisions and by their environment. Okay? So when you are in Mecca or Medina al-Munawwara, for example, do you feel a heightened sense of like, wow, I'm not even gonna pluck a piece of grass or step on an insect or argue, or I'm gonna be so patient although I'm getting pushed all over? What is that? That's that innate sense elevating. In fact, Imam al-Sha'rawi, Muhammad Mutawalli Sha'rawi, rahimahullah, he mentions that this comes from a person's heightened conscience, that they feel shy to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala while being neighbor to the Kaaba, or in the shade of the Kaaba, or neighbor to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And if they could take that attitude and that spirit back to their homes, then they would feel much of this heightened awareness as well. Similarly, a person, as they go through, not only themselves going through ma'asi or acts of disobedience, but just the things we get desensitized to in society, this affects our individual sensibilities and our collective sensibilities as well. What is wrong becomes normal, and that's a corruption of that innate sense. So there are examples even outside of Muslims per se, right? So if you took a scene from a typical American beach, excuse me for the example today, and like showed it to Americans 50 years ago, or especially 100 years ago, that are not Muslim, what would they react as? They would be utterly shocked. They would be totally outraged, because it's not permissible to wear what someone would wear at home outside in public, right? This is not born, of course we have this at a heightened level in our Islamic values, but I'm saying just decent people also had this, but our society has been desensitized to this. Prophet ﷺ talks about one of the signs of the Day of Judgment, that the killer will not know why they killed, and the murdered will not know why they have been killed. So the number of violent crimes that happen around us, this is a disease of our society, right? And so I think exactly as you said, no one can judge us for another person's heart, but we have tools by which to judge our own hearts. And in general, the more acts of obedience and the closer we are to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the sharper that sense is, and the more we have acts of disobedience or we're in environments that are desensitized, this dulls that sense as well. Allah. Any other questions, inshallah?
I'm going to try to put this as best I can. But when given advice, people on different levels, and even the advice you want to give, for example, as a parent, you hope that it will be helpful to your children. But after you give the advice, and it could be psychologically heavy, then what is the advice that you give to get back to a healthy state of mind if the advice you want to talk about causes what's the recovery to that, especially with people you love to live with?
Jazakumullah khairan. Summarize the broader question about giving advice as a parent or in other contexts, especially when it can be psychologically heavy or a person may not receive it. Well, how do you make that judgment call? And in general, a nasiha or advice is a duty of a Muslim to a fellow Muslim, but there's a judgment call. And we spoke about this a little bit with Imam Muammar on the Hadith, Din al-Nasiha. But inshallah, to emphasize a couple points about that judgment. First of all, in general, a nasiha in public is not a nasiha in general, right? General nasiha should be in a manner that is most readily accepted, and people don't like to be shamed or embarrassed. There are very few exceptions to this, like public tyrants and so on and so forth, but in general, that should be the rule in your book. That should be in private in a sensitive way. Similarly, the objective of advice is to bring benefit. So sometimes a person wants to give advice but is not the right person to offer it. The famous story for Imam Abu Hanifa, where his mother had a question, and Imam Abu Hanifa, a great scholar, he had the answer. His mother said, no, I don't want from you, I want from this such and such scholar, right? And so he took his mother on a mount, on an animal to go talk to the scholar, and this scholar is like talking to one of the giants, like Imam Abu Hanifa. This is, alhamdulillah, a Muslim scholar, but not at that scholar. So he looked at him, he said, how can I answer when you're like present? Abu Hanifa said, no, she wants to hear from you. So he said, I don't know the answer. So he said, come here. And he whispered to him the answer, right? And so the scholar gave him the answer. Imam Abu Hanifa related to his mother, and on the whole way back, his mother is talking about such and such scholar, how knowledgeable and great he is, and so on and so forth. It's a very light-hearted story, but a profound one, that ultimately advice is landing on human beings. A respected mother, Abu Hanifa, for us in our language, each of our parents raised us when we were in diapers, you know what I mean? So it doesn't matter if you're the biggest scholar and teacher in the world. And similarly, sometimes children with their own parents, of course they receive advice, but sometimes it's very, very profound to hear that reinforced from a third party. that doesn't stand to benefit or gain from it. This is not in disrespect or taking anything away from the parents, but it's to support that, right? So for example, sometimes in an example of a courtship, right, where people are looking at a marriage, and the parents are giving advice, and the adult children are not that receptive, right? Sometimes when they speak to, if it's a religious question, you know, a trustworthy imam, or if they speak to a Muslim marriage counselor or counselor with the cultural, and they hear the same message, in their mind they're computing, well, this person doesn't have anything to gain from who I marry or not. They could probably care less. You know, they're not emotionally entangled. So that lands very heavily, even if the parent themselves are more eloquent or more, you know, invested and so on and so forth. So advice is always this judgment call. And in general, if a person is really walling off or from advice, I encourage a person to generally pull back a little bit. And especially in our context, you know, in general, a person has everything pulling in the wrong direction except for the parents, except for the small circle of people sharing their values. So that love and that connection can be one of the strongest pulls towards that positive direction, even as you think who else might provide a positive environment or positive role model or even advice. And remember that a lot of advice passively is very impactful. And so this is something near and dear to all of us. Almost all of us have members of our family that are not Muslim or not praying or distant from the path that we genuinely care for and want to help. We have to keep in mind the many nonverbal types of advice and the many other messengers besides ourselves that can genuinely passively push in the right direction. I could bring tears to your eyes with the people that have reformed their life, starting on a basketball court, even starting, utterly drunk and making a sincere dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, people that have started in, punk bands and this and that have become totally reformed and become excellent Muslims. Each of those examples I gave you is not hypothetical. I'm thinking of a name or more than one name that I've encountered living and breathing that have fallen into those categories of others. So we should have hope in people, inshallah, and have a long-term view. Great questions, inshallah. Jazakallah khairan. We'll move to, inshallah, to hadith number 12. We're about a third of the way through of the collection in terms of the material of the ahadith, because many of the first ahadith are a little bit longer. So we'll find several of our classes we may have 4 or 5 ahadith now because they're shorter, especially in this section, which talks a lot about Islamic manners. Very profound ahadith, where obviously each of these ahadith we could take a whole semester talking about. But in terms of Islamic manners in general, we'll talk about some of the foundational issues. But these are ahadith that it's easy for you to further research, further reflect on, because they're not societal or political or sociological in nature. They're not as technical, but they're very profound and take a lifetime to work on. A great book in this regard is the book Islamic Manners by Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, rahimahullah. Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, G-H-U-D-D-A-H. Rahimahullah, great scholar, Syrian scholar of the 20th century. The English translation is extremely well done, very proper, translation, and a short book, and one of my personal favorite books on Islam in English. It's a very short read. I encourage it highly. Islamic Manners by Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda. And it's another book that's escaping my mind. I'll share it with you, inshallah, later in class. Inshallah, the hadith number 12. عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من حسن إسلام المرء تركه ما لا يعنيه حديث حسن رواه الترمذي وغيره هكذا. On the authority of Abu Hurairah, may Allah be pleased with him, who said, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, from the perfection and excellence of a person's Islam is to leave that which does not concern them. Imam Nawawi says a hasan or good hadith related by at-Tirmidhi and other scholars in this word. Again, from the excellence or perfection of a person's Islam is to leave that which does not concern him or her. First of all, in terms of the chain of narration of this hadith. The collection of Imam al-Nawawi's 40 hadith, which are actually 42 ahadith, are largely comprised of authentic or strong ahadith. There are roughly 3 to 4 ahadith which there are some discussion about the strength of the chain of narration and potentially some weakness. It is from our requirements and Islamic etiquettes to be very cautious in narrating about the Prophet ﷺ, because there is a difference between that which is authentically attributed to the Prophet ﷺ with high probability versus other good words that may or may not have been said by him or may be said, of course, by any other person, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. He, the Prophet ﷺ, does not speak according to his whims. It is nothing but a revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This hadith, hadith number 12, is one of those ahadith where there is a long scholarly discussion and criticism of the different chains of narration, and perhaps some scholars suggest that the strongest narration is the narration by the way of Az-Zuhri rahimahullah, but that hadith is what is called a mursal hadith. Those of you that took a couple years ago our kind of short course on usul al-hadith may remember that a mursal hadith is a hadith where the companion is omitted. In other words, it is just from the successors or the tabi'in generation, and the ones with the companion are not established with high authenticity. I don't want to get too technical, but ultimately this is the strongest type of weak hadith. This is the strongest type of weak hadith. Obviously, a good or weak hadith is ultimately a scholarly determination. So Imam al-Nawawi here renders his own opinion that this is not a weak hadith, but a hasan hadith, a good hadith, lower than sahih, stronger than weak. But the majority of the scholars have differed with him in this regard and have discussed what he may mean about this. You can find a long discussion about in this book, for example, commentary on the 40 hadith. If some of you are students of hadith, we can talk about that offline, inshallah. But the summary of this is that in general, weak ahadith, the scholars are very strict in issues of aqidah and creed and fiqh. And weak hadith are entirely inadmissible in these matters, period. So none of the issues of Islamic creed and so on are established on a hadith, even with any element of weakness. To be honest, the element of weakness in this hadith is very light, because it is it is narrated from several different chains which all reinforce one another. A person could make that argument. But that's to ensure that our Islamic practice and our Islamic belief are founded upon strength. But in matters of fada'il al-a'mal, good character, good manners, then some scholars are still strict and don't allow it, but some scholars allow that you narrate a hadith that are weak as long as you identify them as such. What's the reasoning behind this? You know, if a person is reading more Quran, you know, for example, the hadith about Surah Al-Waqi'ah having such and such benefit to it, not the highest degree, but are you going to lose from reading more Quran? You're not, right? This hadith, the meaning of this hadith comes in other texts. But as a teacher, as a speaker, as a youth group leader, as a student, you should always be very cautious of the authenticity of your narrations. Our teacher, Sheikh Muhammad Akram al-Nadawi, Hafidhahullah, he says, never take hadith from the preachers. Always take it from the teachers. Never take hadith from the preachers. Always take it from the teachers. Why? Because a person who's preaching, what's their motivation? They want to move people's hearts, bring people to tears, and it's not a bad thing, but they may be less cautious in authenticating their narrations, right? Whereas in an environment like this, I'm eager to talk about the meaning of the hadith, but I am going to take the 5-10 minutes to tell you, hey, this is what scholars have said, this and that, and that, so you're contextualized. When you do your research, you are going to learn, with due respect and honor to all of our teachers and all of our preachers, that some scholars have a reputation for being very diligent in their research. For example, when I mentioned to you Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, rahimahullah, he's a muhaddith, he's a scholar of hadith, and he took it in his approach that he wanted to write books and make arguments with authentic ahadith. So when you read a work by him, even if you don't have full time to cross-verify and double-check and so on, you have a high degree of confidence that the ahadith that are there are of high strength and relevance. Whereas other respected teachers or preachers, even if they have a lot of great speaking ability and great eloquence, they can be a little bit less academic in this. Why? Because researching a hadith takes a lot of time and is incredibly boring for most people, right? It doesn't bring you to that preaching and so on, because you gotta go this chain and that chain and so on and so forth. So in general, this is important, especially for youth groups and so on. Why? Because if a person is still new to this, and you're one of their first teachers about Islam, and they find out you teach them something, but there was another opinion, or the hadith that you used was very weak, and you made no mention of that. What happens? They start to wonder whether all hadith are weak, whether the entire thing is made up. Okay? And so that's why I really emphasize in these gatherings, do your diligence, right? Do your due diligence. If you know you're not going to have time to cross-verify a hadith, then be very selective in cross-referencing scholars or choosing scholars that are diligent in their research. This hadith, again, still, alhamdulillah, there's extensive commentary on it because it is strengthened by other narrations and its meaning comes in other strong texts. And one of the great scholars of Maliki fiqh, I really love this point. His name is Imam Abu Zayd al-Maliki, rahimahullah. He said that all attributes of goodness stem from 4 ahadith, right? So he's really highlighting some of the aspects of virtue and good manners. The hadith which says to speak well or remain silent, number 1. Number 2, this hadith, mind your own business. Number 3, the hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said to a man, asking him for advice, do not get angry, do not get angry, do not get angry. He repeated it several times. That's hadith number 16, it's come. And number 4, anybody guess? One of the most famous ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and what some people say is the Islamic analog to the golden rule.
Love for your brother what you love.
None of you truly believe or fully believe until you love for your brother what you love for yourself. This scholar says that all aspects of good manners emanate from these 4 ahadith, okay? And all of them are coming in this section of the collection of Imam an-Nawawi. Pause inshallah for a brief discussion here. A very short hadith. From the excellence of a person's Islam is to leave that which does not concern him or her. Form a small group inshallah and extract what lessons can we derive from this hadith. We'll take about 3 to 4 minutes inshallah. What lessons can we derive from this hadith?
First thing I thought was, that story he tried to confront him about it and said, well, you caught me sitting once, you have broken my So I think even if you're trying to, because ultimately the only person who's only being really watching everything. So it's not up to us to be it's ultimately they're taking it to public, we're advocating it, that's not it's not up to you.
I think the main problem for the point is this is with our practice. Yeah, obviously we did get everything but it's the same concept.
Right, if you see
and it's your responsibility. Look, you don't know. They have these licenses. Or like you said, that a lot of He's got his thing, I got mine. If I can advise him or send someone to advise him, yeah, of course I'm gonna do it. If I can't do it, positive.
It goes back, I think, somewhere in the connection between the promise for the
Take one more minute, inshallah.
believe that there will be something
Okay, bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. A lot to expect from this hadith, but I want to focus on a couple things that the scholars have mentioned. This quality of focusing on things that are actually possible and something. Actually, I noticed, alhamdulillah, mashallah, sisters have filled the tables, and a few people are in the back maybe more comfortable on the table. So I was going to ask the brothers if you would compress forward to try to leave one table at least open in the back, inshallah. If any of the sisters want to use one more table. So if I just ask the brothers, just leave one table, inshallah. If you're on the table in the back, see if you can join one of the tables in the front. There's some spaces, inshallah.
one chair here.
Just one table in the back, inshallah, would be great. I appreciate it. Instilling this quality of focusing on what is concern to us and disregarding what is not. This makes deeds more weighty and more valuable in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because we are better prioritizing our time, we are better focusing on things that are of value and importance. And Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, he explains this hadith with a very powerful analogy. He gives the analogy of someone who enters a mine with a sack. So a mine with, like a gold mine with precious gold and diamonds and precious stones and all of these incredible valuable things. And they're in that mine. And they have a sack with them, so they have the capability to transport things outside of that mine. And what does that person do? They reach down with the sack and they start shoveling dirt into the sack. And they walk out with a sack full of what? Full of dirt, right? Imam al-Ghazali, he gives this example with regards to this hadith. Why? Because that person had this opportunity to bring value into their lives, right? In this analogy, they had this opportunity to gather gold and things that are found. What did they do? They burdened themselves with a bunch of worthless stuff, right? They took that which is not worthwhile, right? So this approach is especially timely now because of this age of information overload and constant connection, right? Because we have so many things, that can just eat up endless hours without feeling it, right? And not all of these things are prohibited. Some of these things are permissible. And yet, social media, the endless kind of TV seasons and Netflix and whatnot, right? Even the news, which, some news is genuinely beneficial and connects us to people, but a lot of news is just pure entertainment, right? Particularly things like entertainment news, which is overwhelmingly gossip and and getting into things that are not our business. Who's marrying who and divorcing who and who's doing this and that. Who cares? Like what value does this bring? Not only what value does it bring, a lot of times it brings what? It brings real harm. Like some of these people, for example, these celebrity divorces, right? You think these kids are not like other kids? You think they enjoy being plastered all over the news? You don't think it's painful enough to be going through what they're going through, right? And so to see people enjoying the troubles and faults of others is a very serious reflection of diseases in our hearts. And to me, one of the times that I most directly connect with this, sadly, is when the power is out, right? Like when the power is out, you're like, whoa, like what just happened, right? Like there's all this life that we didn't know existed because we're so surrounded with this overload of stuff. It's interesting, that Islamic Manners book that I read, that I indicated to you, I apologize. The Islamic Manners book that I indicated to you, it's really amazing to see the standards of some of our scholars. Remember I talked about straddling the line and being like 1 inch removed from haram. One of the manners he mentions in that book is that before you visit people, make sure you've used the facilities, because it may be inconvenient to somebody if you have to use the restroom. It's like, whoa man, that's like next level stuff. You know what I'm saying? Like, to think that much about a person's comfort, and it doesn't mean it's haram to use the restroom, in somebody's house, but I'm saying from manners, what's the level you're holding yourself to? Sheikh Abdul Fattah also mentioned in this book a manner that's relevant to this hadith that you may not think of. He says when somebody has to cancel an appointment or a meeting with you, don't ask why. Why? Because there may be an element of embarrassment, right? Maybe if they had to cancel something, maybe they have something that they don't really want to share, or maybe it's a little embarrassing, or maybe it's a health issue. So, again, there are priorities in our deen, but when you see someone mentioning these issues as manners, you see that Islam elevates things to a whole nother level. Really, Islamic manners are like a whole nother level. And Imam Ibn al-Qayyim, he mentions that the basic aspects of good conduct actually are not unique to Muslims. All decent human beings do good things. But taqwa is one of the things that differentiates the believer. That they do good when they're not going to be recompensed for it, when they're not going to be appreciated, when nobody's going to notice. That taqwa and God consciousness is a motivator, right? For things like caring for the environment, like animal rights, like human rights, is a big differentiator. And in fact, one of the reasons, as you see the political winds shift right and left on some of these issues, one of the arguments for the necessity of faith and connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imam al-Hasan al-Basri, rahimahullah, he actually says that one of the signs that Allah has turned away from a servant is that they find him or herself constantly preoccupied and engaged in matters that are not of their concern. Again, Hasan Basri says, one of the signs that Allah has turned away from a servant is that they find themselves constantly preoccupied with things that do not concern them. Okay? So this manner is incredibly important to help us benefit ourselves in this life and the next. What is beyond the beneficial is a waste of time, and is things to be avoided as much as possible. I gave the example of entertainment news. Sometimes you see somebody having a conversation, kind of find an excuse to find your way into that conversation. All of these things, big and small, lead down this destructive path. One of the things that we have to be very cautious of is when somebody asks us or is talking about something that is not in one's area of expertise, yet you feel that desire to comment on it, right? And this is one of the very strong ways to build this manner in our lives, is to refrain from speaking about things that we do not know. When I hear an issue, when I hear a question, even if I'm in a youth group or an MSA and somebody asks a very legitimate question, but I know that I don't know, don't let that social pressure push you to comment about it. Ask yourself, am I qualified to have an opinion on this issue? Does me offering this opinion bring benefit, or does the harm outweigh it? And after I offer that opinion, is it more likely that this conversation will improve or degrade? Some practical examples, a sheikh was a guest, qari was visiting a masjid in the US from overseas. And this qari was from an area of the world where, the Muslim majority world, where there was very, very divisive political issues going on. So this brother from the people that were praying in Ramadan, he walks up to the qari and he starts striking up small talk. Just chatting. And he says, are you like from party A or party B anyway, right? Imagine again, the example doesn't really work in America, but it's like asking you Republican or Democrat, but in a time of great strife and division, even resulting in death and so on and so forth. The sheikh smiled at him and he looked around. He's like, are we in the house of Allah or are we somewhere else? Right? And so it really struck me, the smile, the answer, and the situational awareness to recognize, first of all, the person should not have asked that question. But even being asked that question, he recognized that any answer that he was going to give was going to result in destruction. Either way, there was no positive answer. Even if this topic was worthy of discussion, the setup, the time, the place were all wrong. Colleague Imam, who was sitting in his office, and this brother walked into the office, and he started talking up some small talk, trying to get the Imam to commit to an ideology, right? Because obviously our masajid are multi-madhab, multi-ideology, etc., in terms of the mainstream acceptable Islam. We're not talking about issues of kufr and so on, just issues that are open to difference. So he said, talking. And they started asking, do you lean towards this scholar or that scholar? And the Imam smiled. And then he kept prodding, and he came at this question from like 5 different angles. Asked about political parties, scholarly leanings, fiqh questions, and so on. And at the end, this brother wasn't getting what he wanted, so he looked at the Imam, he said, you're a really good listener. And he walked, and the Imam smiled and he went like this. And then he walked out the office, right? SubhanAllah, to be very aware that, again, if you're the questioner, you shouldn't present these issues because there's no beneficial answer. That's any of our business. Again, this is not asking a person if they believe in Allah or not, or something in terms of the things that you have the right to know about, in terms of mainstream things. But issues of legitimate difference, issues that are not our business. That's why you'll notice in asking this question, is this my business? Useful questions to ask. Is this my business? Is this of concern to me? Am I qualified to have an opinion on this? Will my involvement in this matter bring benefit that outweighs the potential harm? When you read the works of our scholars, like Islamic manners, like Islamic character, Khuluq al-Muslim by Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, other works, you will find that the line they're trying to draw is not between haram and everything else. That they are recognizing that excess in many permissible matters leads inevitably towards waste of time, losing obligations, and most likely outright haram. Excess in permissible or mubah matters leads to waste of time, missing out on obligatory things, and most likely haram, right? So even when we talk about sporting matches and so on and so forth, right? You'll see the answers in terms of permissibility for so many scholars is conditioned on what? On not being in excess and not busying a person from their obligations. Why? Because a lot of people that watch the Super Bowl miss Maghrib or Isha or whatever part of the world you're in, right? A lot of people that watch these matches, they miss the obligatory salah. A lot of people that watch these matches, for example, engage in the inevitable haram that's in the marketing or advertising and so on, don't have the system or the discipline to avoid that stuff and just stick to the permissible. So I have to be very conscious and aware with ourselves because these are some of the doors of shaitan that lead a person down this path. A couple quick points on how to attain this quality. We've mentioned some of these already, but number one of the Islamic characteristics that build this quality is haya, modesty and a degree of healthy shyness. Sadly, this characteristic is one of the most absent characteristics among Muslims and in the world in general today, because a lot of what's in our society erodes this humility and shyness and modesty before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَمْ يَحْسَبُونَ أَنَّ لَا نَسْمَعُ سِرَّهُمْ وَنَجْوَاهُم. Do they believe that we do not hear their secrets and private counsels? Indeed we do, and our messengers are by them to record. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about His watchfulness and how He's aware and hears even our private counsel, discussions and secrets. Number two, which we spoke about extensively, is controlling speech. And number three is examining how you spend your time. Al-Hasan al-Basri mentioned that the human being is nothing but a compilation or a gathering of breaths. And every time a person breathes, then part of them has expired, right? And so recognizing the importance of time and investing it importantly, correctly. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah An-Nisa, Surah number 4, verse number 114, لا خير في كثير من نجواهم إلا من أمر بصدقة أو معروف أو إصلاح بين الناس. Most of their discussions do not contain any good except the one who enjoins charity or goodness or peacemaking among people. So even in our social gatherings and so on, we should have some aspect of goodness in our discussions and of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It doesn't mean don't have fun, doesn't mean act like a sheikh in the middle of the sports field or whatever, right? Healthy recreation is an important part of our life, but balance and prioritization are the hallmarks of the believers. This hadith can really be summarized in understanding priorities. Understanding priorities is a big part of understanding this hadith. Not only being concerned about what concerns us is our business, but also how relevant and valuable it is. And some time management experts have indicated that effective time management is more about what you say no to than what you say yes to. Because so many pulls and demands on the believer today. The Prophet ﷺ says, فَأَعْطِ كُلَّ ذِي حَقٍّ حَقًّا. Give every party their due right. Okay, I want to pause for a moment. First of all, inshallah, I welcomed everyone. For those of you that joined us after the beginning, welcome again. I'm really happy to see you. And for those of you that it's your first time, just so you know, we always have a lot to do. So we maintain a pretty relaxed environment. I don't take bona fide breaks per se, but we have a lot of discussions and so on. So whenever you have any need, you just step out comfortably, inshallah, and don't worry about that. Secondly, inshallah, we had at the beginning of the class a count off for those that were there right in the beginning. So I want you to raise your hand real quick if you don't have a number. Can you raise your hand if you don't have a number, right? If you haven't had a number today, we're just going to count off starting from 41. Does anybody have the number 41? No. So we'll start, keep your hands up and put it down when you count off a number. So we'll have 41 and then count your numbers. Put your hand down when you have a number.
44, 45, 46.
Oh, sorry. Was 47? 47? 48.
51.
Okay.
52. 53. 54. 55.
Anyone not have a number?
60.
I guess I apologize. Then you're 63. Sorry about that. Okay, awesome. So we have a first for our class, inshallah. We're going to have a little book giveaway. Okay? So these are some books that have affected me or that I've enjoyed, inshallah. And so I want to introduce these books to you. And we'll just have it, I have a random number generator here. If your number is called and you're here, you can claim this book, inshallah. If you have the book, or you're not going to commit to reading it, or whatever reason, you can just politely decline. Okay? So we've just been talking about manners, so I'm not going to make you say to the universe that you're not going to commit to reading it. But if that is the reason, that's one of the reasons to politely decline. Other reasons are you have it or whatever, or you want somebody else to have it, no problem. Just when I call your number, you can just politely decline. This book is called God, Islam, and the Skeptic Mind, a study on faith, science, religious diversity, ethics, and evil. It's by Sayyid Farid Ahmed and Sayyid Salahuddin Ahmed. These are actually a father and son author. Alhamdulillah, I had the blessing of meeting Brother Salahuddin in Dallas, Texas, some years ago. So this is actually a signed copy.
Oh.
Each can add.
Oh my God.
And
Is there money inside?
Can we have bidding on
don't
it?
think of it.
It's an auction.
This book talks about some of the big question issues. So not less about the specific discussions around, say, a doubt like age of Aisha or theory of evolution, but rather more on some of the big philosophical and psychological, philosophical and existential questions around common questions and issues of doubt today. This book was out of print for a long, long time. It was very heavily demanded. It's easier to find now. But this is the second edition, and actually, inshallah, the area MSAs will be hosting a one-day seminar on deconstructing doubt, inshallah. It'll be regionally held in March, probably March 23rd, inshallah. It'll be a Saturday. So this is one of the references for that one-day seminar, inshallah. And so I'm going to have this book for those that were here in the very beginning, just to honor you for being there in the beginning. So I have our number generator, you gave number 24. This is number 24. Do you like the book, inshallah?
I thought he was gonna. His arm came down. I thought he was gonna throw it. I was like, okay.
63.
So this second book will be for the whole, everyone in attendance now, inshallah. This book is a fascinating book. This is a book in Arabic, it's called Al-Islam Yatahadda. It's translated into English as God Arises, Evidence of God in Nature and in Science. And I'm going to embarrass myself by not remembering the Urdu name of this work. But this work is also published in Urdu, but I forget the title, I apologize. But it's been very extensively, actually the book was originally written in Urdu, right? So the original work is in Urdu, but then, alhamdulillah, it's been translated to like more than a dozen languages all across the world. One of the very commonly published and distributed books. The interesting thing about this book was it was first written in 1966. And you'd think a book on this topic would not weather well over those 50 years as a lot of scientific developments and so on occur. And yet, subhanAllah, the author was given tawfiq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then a lot of their foundational discussions about the nature of religion and Quran and so on and so forth. Maulana Wahiduddin Khan, and he's written a number of other, He's written more than a dozen books, well-known author, mashallah, from the subcontinent. This is Al-Islam Yatahadda, God Arises, and inshallah we have it for number 21.
Okay, something's wrong here.
Yeah. I'm doing random.org and they have a whole long discussion about the true randomness of it. But if any of you computer science geeks want to correct me between now and next week, do you like it, inshallah? Jazakumullah khairan. So we'll have more, inshallah, throughout the semester. But I also don't want to clean out all my stashes on the first day. I want you to still come for the rest of the semester, inshallah. We'll have some nice giveaways from time to time, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. Inshallah, we will move to Hadith number 13. عن أبي حمزة أنس بن مالك رضي الله عنه خادم رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه رواه البخاري ومسلم. On the authority of Abu Hamza, Anas ibn Malik, may Allah be pleased with him, the servant of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he said, none of you truly believes until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself. Related by Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim. This hadith discusses an extremely important concept. It's the so-called golden rule of Islam. This characteristic of loving for others what one loves for themselves has to do with pursuing that soundness and purity of heart. A person wishing the best for themselves is not an accomplishment. It's natural, right? A person wishing the best for themselves is natural. But when a person is wishing the best for others as they wish for themselves, it's indicating, inshallah, a higher spiritual level and a purer heart. Many diseases of the heart get in the way of this attribute. What is one disease of the heart that comes to mind? That can block it? Jealousy, right? And even in our tradition, there are separate words indicating a jealousy that is accompanied with a desire for loss for the other person, or the concept of hasad, for example, which is envy coupled with a desire that you gain and another person loses, versus, there's no English word for this, but like a healthy jealousy. In Arabic it's called ghira, right? Like being, for example, that a person not like that they be exposed in front of people or their family members be exposed. There's no English word for this. Jealousy, as I've encountered it in English, is predominantly used negatively. But in Islam or in Arabic primary terminology, there are separate words that are indicating, for example, a person that is given, the Prophet ﷺ says that, positive jealousy is in two matters. A person that is given wealth, so he gives it in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by day and night, and a person that is given Quran, so they recite it by day and night. So that jealousy, which is not jealousy in English, it's a word that we don't have, is one where you see somebody that has more in a positive thing indeed, and you wish for them to retain their blessing, but you also wish that you increase in this. This is healthy. Why? Because it motivates you to do good. A lot of what we call jealousy in English is that we want loss for others and we want gain for ourselves. And this is one of the things that really destroys the heart, to be able to acquire this prophetic characteristic that is discussed here. How do we avoid jealousy? the ulama mention several pieces of advice. The first is remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And specifically, what names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us avoid jealousy? What are some examples of names and attributes of Allah that impact our understanding in a way that helps us avoid jealousy? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Razzaq. He is the provider of provision. So no matter what you do, that provision is set before we come onto this world in a manner that is full of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wisdom, and it cannot be changed. And it is decreed in a way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills. He gives whom He wills and withholds from whom He wills. A person that knows this does their part. You study, you work hard, you try to earn an honest living, but at the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a portion of this dunya. Not everyone will be a ruler, not everyone will be rich, and la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There can be no change in state, nor gaining of power except by Allah's permission. This is not to make a person complacent. It's to make them not transgress bounds when they don't get what they want or what they wish for. Okay. What other names or attributes of Allah affect our understanding in this regard? Al-Kareem, the generous and giver. Al-Adl, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just in His judgments. He is just, and specifically in this dunya, we know that giving is not a sign of Allah's contentment, and withholding is not a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's displeasure. This is one of the most common questions I receive from Muslims, by the way, and it's explicitly answered in the Holy Quran in many places, but among them Surah Al-Fajr. فأما الإنسان إذا ما ابتلاه ربه فأكرمه ونعمه فيقول ربي أكرمن وأما إذا ما ابتلاه فقدر عليه رزقه فيقول ربي أهان. Right? As for the human being, when he is tested by his Lord, so He gives him honor and plenty and blessing, then he says, my Lord has honored me. And when he tests him, and he restricts his provision, he says, my Lord has debased or humiliated me. And what's right after that? Kalla. It's all wrong, all incorrect. Because Allah's giving is not a sign of His pleasure, Allah's withholding is not a sign of His displeasure. Surah Az-Zukhruf, Surah number 43, is one of the surah. It's a very powerful surah to read in this regard. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says what means that if it were not for the fact that human beings would become one ummah, He would give those that disbelieve, and then the Quran has this magnificent description of roofs from precious metals and silver and gold and adornment and so on. And He'd give this to who? Believers or disbelievers?
Disbelievers.
Disbelievers. Why? Because this dunya is worthless in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that this would be too much for most people. That this would be so overwhelming for people, people would find it difficult to believe. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not test us past our capacity. But as a beginning, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's giving of this dunya, Allah gives it to those that He loves and those that He detests. But Allah gives in the akhirah only to those that He loves, that He's pleased with. Also, Allah's Malik al-Mulk, He's the owner and master of all things. So He has it all. If He wills, He will give it. If He wills, He will withhold. This understanding from an Imani point of view doesn't mean that there aren't tears, doesn't mean that it isn't difficult, but it's a foundational element in building one of the important characteristics that we'll come to momentarily. Some other characteristic, yes, question?
So that is a little bit interesting because sometimes you go through your day and things happen to you and you say, okay, maybe I need to reflect on what I did the past week, maybe something went wrong. So does that take away the idea of people who have taqwa, they have maybe an easier life because Allah is on their side? So how do you kind of draw the line between, okay, if everything happens, regardless of your actions, right, and your wealth, your family, work, So how do you respond to this idea of maybe I did something wrong the past week or yesterday, or so maybe this is a reminder for me to correct.
Jazakallah khair. And a beautiful question. And the important thing to notice here is that when a calamity occurs to a person or a hardship, what might that be from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? It could be a sign, right? It could be a sign because a person has transgressed, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving them a sign rather than giving them punishment in the hereafter. But who's tested more than any human being? The prophets, right? For them, these are not signs of disobedience, right? Because they're at that different level. So what else can it be? For other human beings, it can also be a punishment brought to this dunya to alleviate a more severe punishment in the hereafter. There's certain classes of disobedience that bring hardship in this dunya before the hereafter. For example, uquq al-walidain, or disobedience of the parents, is one of the things that the punishment is not delayed exclusively to the hereafter. Similarly, eating from haram, right? Having haram income has negative repercussions in this dunya before accountability in the hereafter. So something that happens could be a punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even for a believer. But it can also be a purification and expiation of sins in general, right? Prophet ﷺ indicates this in a hadith. It can be elevation in ranks in Jannah. Sometimes a person has not done enough good deeds, especially when you read about the qiyam and the charity and just the levels of a salaf as-salih. You're like, how can you make it? We're asking for firdaus al-a'la in these high levels. So sometimes a person or one of our loved ones goes through some hardship or sickness or so on as elevation of levels, right? Not just purification. So Allah can bring them to a level in Jannah that He wishes for them, although their good deeds are not enough to make it that high. All of these, if a car comes by and splatters some mud water on me, or I get sick, or any hardship could be any of these things. Any of these things. So the believer that goes through life is always attuned and is always looking for these signs, right? Sometimes a person does a small deed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just to wake them up, car comes and splatters you with a bunch of water. Immediately you think, you know what, a couple of days ago I was lacking this, I understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's a believer that's awake, right? Some people don't wake up. I know a very sweet brother who was far from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and kept going through hardship and still partying and doing this and doing that until they got into a severe accident. And that brother describes for himself that was their wake-up call. Switched their entire life, right? So that person, he dealt with that as a sign from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some people don't get the message until they're dragged on the day of judgment and compelled before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the believer should be balanced in blaming themselves before judging others, right? This muhasaba, reviewing oneself. Sayyidina Umar ibn Khattab says to bring yourself to account before you are brought to account before others by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But should not go into an excess where they are humiliating or debasing themselves and see that everything that happened, oh, woe is me, I'm a horrible Muslim, I stink, I'm this. The Prophet got sick. If Allah didn't want the Prophet to get sick, he would have gotten sick. Prophet ﷺ lost children, had parents that died, had loved ones that died. So also a person should not go to excess in seeing every up and down in dunya as a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's signs or punishment, right? It should receive this. And I love sharing the story of the elder. There's a person known for piety, and people would ask him for, dua, not to alleviate their own responsibility for dua, but just hoping, inshallah, that his dua was close to acceptance. This is in our times, in the 20th century. So people come to him, ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to cure my mother, ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to do that. So this young man came, and he said, I want you to make dua that I have no problems. And the elder man, he looked at him and he said, son, in dunya there must be problems. So also part of the nature of this life is that it's always up and down, right? From Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's blessings, we don't get tested too often. It's not like a year we have a dozen calamities. Sometimes you have a calamity or two in a year. This is the nature of dunya that no one escapes from. Really, one of the powerful things for those going through hardship, and we all go through periods of life in hardship, first of all, reading Surah Yusuf is one of the things that calms and consoles the soul. SubhanAllah, Prophet Yusuf is one of those stories where you see every time you think something is happening that's good, it ends up in a disaster, dunya-wise. His father loves him, the result is his brothers can't stand him and cast him into the well. He has an honorable master, the result is the wife of this person does this, he ends up in jail. Every time something looks like it's bad, ends up in incredible good. When he's alone in the well, he ends up in a society that has a lot of abuse and wrongdoing and slaves. He ends up in the hands of a generally good man that teaches him the skills that he becomes minister with later. In jail is the start of his dawah. And so it's one of the powerful stories that we engage with as we're going through hardship in our lives, and also inshallah reading the story of the Prophet ﷺ. Some scholars estimate that in 23 years of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, that he had no more than 2 months of relative stability in dunya. Even on the day of Badr, what happened? On the day of Badr, what happened to the Prophet? His daughter died, right? Imagine burying your daughter on the day that finally, after 15 years of persecution, you have a victory against these oppressors, right? Prophet ﷺ dealt with famine, dealt with hardship, 5 different homes before his 20s, orphaned twice, lost his grandparents, buried so many of his children. So these are some of the things that also console us going through dunya. So that element's a balance, right? And that balance takes effort and striving to attain it. Other ways to avoid jealousy, number 2, is a characteristic that I don't know an English word for. In Arab, and sadly it's not emphasized as much as it was. It's called in Arabic al-ithar. Al-ithar. And it means to prefer others over yourself. Ithar. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this in Surah Al-Hashr, verse number 9. It says, وَيُؤْثِرُونَ عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ وَلَوْ كَانَ بِهِمْ خَصَاصًا. Speaking about the Ansar of the companions who received the Muhajirin that left everything behind for this deen. Abu Bakr, by our standards, was a millionaire. Abdurrahman ibn Auf was a millionaire. Uthman ibn Affan was a millionaire. Salama was subjected to that. Her son was literally wrestled. Her baby son was literally wrestled from her arms. These great companions sacrificed big time. And the Ansar were so moved, the Ansar were already in Medina, were so moved by receiving these Muhajirin that they gave almost everything they had in dunya. They gave to them. And there's these heartwarming stories of people that, among the Ansar that did not have food, but they wanted the Muhajirin to eat, and so they would stage almost as if they had food with their families so they could eat comfortably, but they didn't have enough food for both of them. This is called al-ithar, to prefer one over yourself. With people especially that we have grudges with people that you have beef with, as we say, with people, cousins, uncles, aunts that we've had some distance from. Pushing yourself to have ithar. I'm not saying be obnoxious, right? I'm not saying invite someone to your home that you're not on talking terms to. But making genuine and sincere dua for them and working against your lower self. Finding the ability to say Eid Mubarak or to check on them. Don't be obnoxious, right? Don't take a relationship that's totally damaged and try to do something artificial. But finding those things is from the elements of an ithar, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَن يُوقَ شُحَّ نَفْسِهِ, right? فَأُولَئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. The one that is protected from their own shuh, these are the truly successful. Ashuh is an extreme miserliness where I want everything for myself, right? So how do you work against it? You have to break it at times, right? And when iftar is late and there isn't that much food to go around, that's a time to practice iftar, right? Because you really want it, right? And one of the challenges of being blessed with so much here in America, so much of us tested with relative plenty, is that you feel that it's all to go around. So when you have those opportunities, when you're traveling, when the food is late, you know, at Hajj and Umrah, who are the most difficult groups? Alhamdulillah, not from IR, inshallah. But all across the world, who has the reputation of being the worst?
America.
Americans, right? Why? Because if the water is so late, because we're used to water fountain here and this and that. Sometimes in life, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests us. We should exercise patience and genuinely wishing this for others. Also for parents, I really recommend that we find opportunities to get out of our apartments and homes and just experience life. You know, some psychologists talk about fishing and the power to teach patience, right? Or again, that scarcity that we don't experience, many of us often. When you're out in a park and it's hot and there's only so many water bottles that you've lugged and so on, those are all very healthy life skills, especially to expose young people to and to practice ourselves. Number 3, al-rida, or being content with what we have. We have this concept of competing with the Joneses in America, right? My neighbor has a boat, I need to buy a boat. They have a nicer car, I need to buy a nicer car. They have this, they have that. And connecting with whom checks this. Connecting with whom in our lives checks this impulse.
Allah.
Connecting with Allah, yes. And then connecting with those that are less privileged and less fortunate than you. Okay? Giving online is beautiful. It helps us connect with people, but you need to find a way for you and your families to get out and physically see and connect with people that are less privileged. Some of our, local organizations, mashallah, they host these project downtown or working in a soup kitchen or volunteering. MLK Day, there's a lot of service opportunities. Habitat for Humanity, where you get out and sweat and build. Anything where you get out and connect physically and see people that are less privileged, this checks this natural human impulse to always want more and acquire more. What's one of the worst places where you see everybody who has more and is happy and is as great as can be?
Black Friday.
Oh, that's true. I was thinking about Black Friday. Black Friday definitely is one of those seasons.
That's why.
But I'm thinking about a place where people are always happy and always fed and always ecstatic and always on vacation. Social media, right? And especially picture-oriented ones like Instagram or Facebook or whatever, right? This is really a big challenge for our hearts. Don't obsess over social media. Now I know you're like, oh God, here comes another imam, don't use social media. I know he's probably trapped in the 15th century. No, I'm serious. Like, check your hearts and your appetite. Because everything you see on social media, most of the non-news driven stuff, is at people's times of peak happiness and perfection. I have been hacking up a storm and as sick as can be and as miserable and grimacing like I'm trying to control my grimaces in front of your faces and sounding like I swallowed a live frog for 2 weeks. Do you think you have pictures on my Facebook of me barking all over the place and doing this and doing? Of course not, right? Why? Because we always display on these things our moments of achievement natural. So you should check this in 2 regards. As a poster on social media, there's a healthy amount to celebrate your successes. Alhamdulillah, you graduated. Alhamdulillah, you're blessed with this. But you should always be aware that some people are seeing this, that at the moment are not being tested with plenty like you, they're being tested with hardship. going overboard on something like, I'm just gonna get real, right? I could give you all this fake stuff and tell you wudu is up to the elbow and so on, and tell you things you've heard 100 times. I want this to be applicable. When you, alhamdulillah for your marriage, alhamdulillah that you found somebody, alhamdulillah that you're having a good time, I'm not telling you to hide that. But there's somebody looking at those pictures that have been searching, having a hard time for 5 years. There's somebody looking at those pictures that is going through a separation that's rocky and very emotional. Being excessive is really not necessary, right? And like everything we're learning in our mountain is there's a balance. We can share the good news and the blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't go overboard. Be sensitive about others, right? Well, I think some people photograph their food more than they'll actually enjoy it, right? Be very aware of that. Be just very cognizant of your intentions and why you're doing these things. And as a consumer, we should also be aware of our hearts. We should moderate our time and appetite for social media. I mean, how many people have you seen have given up Facebook for a little bit and all of a sudden psychologically they're feeling better and so on. There was a study recently where there was a control group where there was no change and another group where they were restricted to 10 minutes of use of social media per day without making any other changes to diet, relationship. Everything else in life was as whatever it was. That group that moderated their social media reported a decrease in depression, in anxiety, in so many psychological issues, just from they didn't cut it off, they moderated it. Okay. If you want to cut it off, that's fine too. Some people do that. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you, if you engage this platform, be mindful and purposeful about it. And so engaging it also, sometimes we need a reality check. These moments are snapshots of the best moments of people's lives. There's a story there that's not told. Not because these people are liars, not because it's hypocritical. These are snapshots of life, not life itself. And there may have been a lot of struggle and a lot of hardship to get to that point. So we also need to remind ourselves of this so that our appetite does not get out of control and that we have perspective. We understand that everybody goes through struggle, everybody goes through sad times, and it's tough for people to engage just with those happiest moments while they're going through hard times. So try to find moderation. In this regard also, I really have a serious issue with a lot of these filters and artificial doctoring of photographs and so on and so forth, right? And now, social media is not that old, but just in the last couple of years, I've seen the first actual academic studies about, especially young women and also young men, experiencing actual disorders and psychological trauma over not feeling essentially comfortable in their own skin. Why? Because they engage doctored photographs so much that they start to believe that that's normal. So especially for parents, especially for youth group leaders, especially with younger people that are forming their personality and going through adolescent years, you have to be very, very cognizant that overconsumption of social media can literally alter your perception of reality, right? So no human being has just a perfect form and no blemishes, right? Alhamdulillah, in our deen, if a person is tested with something, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests in different ways. If you have something that's outside the norm, there's no harm in seeing a doctor or something to restore, that which is normal to the extent that's medically possible. But in general, our deen teaches us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fashioned us and created us and perfected our creation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created everything beautiful. And if the appetite of social media is getting to a level where a person is starting to feel that the artificial is normal, that's a big issue. And that really messes up people, right? And sadly, I just want, like I said, I try to keep an elevated discourse, but I also want to be realistic and respect the amana of this time. This is like destroying relationships, new marriages. Why? Because people come in with fake Hollywood, artificial expectations of what marriage is and what physical realities are for the opposite gender. I'm sorry, I'm just going to be realistic. So we shouldn't be engaging that stuff in the first place and consuming it. but understand that consumption of everything from these photos to the over sexualized and immodest norms in Hollywood, which have gotten much worse over the last decade or two, make a person have expectations in their relationships and especially in their marriage that are not human. They're not attainable. Some of these actors, right, they have dietitians that moderate their diet. They work out 4 or 5 hours a day. Some of roles where a person is cast into outer space and they want to make them starving, or they're cast to be the super strong athlete. They literally spend 6 months of their lives artificially changing their habits to get to that physical form. I have news. You and I are normal human beings, right? You can't work out 6 hours a day because you have to earn a living, right? And you have responsibilities and you have ibadah and you have this and that. So be very aware of this because this really messes people up psychologically. And there's a whole spectrum. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us. But this starts as simple as seeing overly made up photographs of people day and night until that seems like that's normal. And it goes much further than that into promiscuous images and pornography and real evils. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us. So be cautious of the beginning of the path so that we and our loved ones don't end up on the end of the path. That's an important part, inshallah, of being very cautious of building this jealousy and building these unrealistic expectations. Building this hadith into our lives makes us truly happy for others, makes us make dua from our hearts, makes us understand that Allah gives and takes and decrees with full wisdom. And that doesn't happen by accident. That doesn't happen by wishful thinking. Tazkiyah and purification of the soul and elevation spiritually is a process. It's a process in which people have to confront our lower selves, our dunya pulls, right? And that's why I'm trying to engage some of these realities around us so we can build these tools. You know, a heartwarming example of the power of this hadith, famous Muslim of the 20th century, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Malcolm X, rahimahullah. He encountered this hadith before he knew it was a hadith. He encountered this statement not knowing it was from the Prophet originally, alayhi salatu wasalam. And it stuck with him, it impacted him, and coming from the background of black nationalism and Nation of Islam, it empowered his transformation, especially after his visit to Mecca, where he saw this concept of brother, meaning brother or sister, that our brothers and sisters in humanity, encompassing everyone, irrespective of color. And he was touched in Mecca al-Mukarramah in his words, and you can see it in his autobiography, coming from a background where people were preaching due to genuine, real grievances, genuine injustices, but that were misapplied into seeing, the white man as the devil, and seeing that it's impossibility for the coexistence of these in the same social framework. And he saw in Mecca people in his description that were blue-eyed, blonde, white as can be, praying next to Native Africans that were darker than many African Americans in the US, and people from Asia, and people from Europe, and all these people, when the Imam says Allahu Akbar, they're all standing, all silent, all bowing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This hadith, amazingly, was one of the keys that he discusses that made him into Malcolm after Mecca, right? That made him into recognize the great power of this deed and these timeless and amazing and beautiful wisdoms that the words of the Prophet ﷺ have the power to transform other people's lives in this way. So inshallah, we'll have a couple minutes for questions, and I'll tell you what's coming up next, inshallah. So any questions about what we've discussed today?
It's not really a question, but so when you were saying for al-ithar, an English equivalent, I think you might be able to use altruistic because that's kind of putting others needs above your own.
Sure.
If that's benefit?
Could be a close one. In al-ithar, there's no harm in expecting the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and also living a person's needs. So that would be some distinction of altruism, but it's probably one of the closest ways of English. Other questions or comments? If there's anything online as well. Reflections. Criticisms. Protests. Yes.
For the hadith you just mentioned, the Arabic translation for it is لا يحب أحدكم لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه. So that means is that only for believers, you can consider them as brothers? So I heard you saying others.
No. And actually, I forgot to mention this, and I'm glad that you brought it up. Actually, explicitly, obviously, we have a special bond with Muslims, that bond of faith and that belonging to the Ummah. But actually, a number of ulama have indicated that this concept of brother actually extends to all of humanity. That this is one of the human characteristics that a person develops and trains themselves to genuinely wish well for others and to have these characteristics with people, even unbelievers. Certainly some ulama have seen it as extending to Muslim brothers and sisters, but this is an existing commentary from many scholars, including classical scholars, that saw this as a universal characteristic to all people.
I have a question. So, just to piggyback on what you're saying right there, is there a particular, let's say, dua or, I guess, way to handle that those around you put down that notion that you think of good, you're thinking that humanity is good, you want to do the best, you want to wish the best for other people, but then the negative commentary is like, well, but are they even thinking about you? And, it just very, negative, right? And it kind of impact, it goes back to the first hadith where, in terms of environment and just, you don't need to think about doing good because nobody else is thinking about you.
Sheikh Muhammad al-Ghazali, he talks about Islamic character, and one of the characteristics he gives is that when a person has this characteristic, they aim for a standard where they hold fast to these values that emanate from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, irrespective of the change in circumstance or place or time. So our ideal, Prophet ﷺ says, Prophet ﷺ describes part of his core mission to perfect the norms of character and our ethics and values. So as Muslims, I connect and empathize with where these attitudes may naturally come from, in that much of the Muslim Ummah has been subjected to economic oppression, social oppression, colonization, injustice. A lot of people do not have freedom, right, to pursue the right to pursue things in life. And so sometimes that can manifest itself in an attitude that, well, people have been oppressive, people have been wrongdoers. Why should we care about them when they do wrong? I understand that emotion, I connect with it. And yet, when we hold ourselves to the standards of our deen, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not condition most of these manners and characteristics to a person's belief or not. Many of these manners and characteristics extend to all the decent humanity, and even to those that aren't good. So the best example is the Prophet ﷺ, right? The man that used to always leave trash and garbage on his doorstep. What did the Prophet ﷺ do when he found it missing? He went to check on him, found that he was sick, right? The Prophet ﷺ, of course, all of Fath Makkah, one of the greatest bloodless, transitions, against people that had oppressed him and his people immeasurably, but he forgave, right? So the technicalities of this are detailed. For example, in an actual murder case, the victims do not have to forgive. They can seek a court-based punishment, Islamically, but forgiveness is higher, right? So similarly, when we see the prophets, they excelled towards people that were awful to them. They honored people that were the most demeaning and debasing to them. And the outcome of that was many of those people became reformed and great people, right? You know, in a typical kid's story, there's a good guy and the bad guy, right? And the person in distress. And how's the story end? The good guy destroys the bad guy and the person in distress. Now you can tell all your kids that they don't even need to worry about Disney. I just summarized all the stories for you, right? But Surah Yusuf, what happens? All of the bad guys become good people. They become reformed, they become transformed. That wouldn't have been possible if Sayyidina Yusuf had dismissed them. So again, this is a very practical issue. If I'm in a gathering, you know, and some people in our community, they've lost people to war. They've lost people to oppression. And so naturally that puts a weight on the heart. I'm not going to start fighting with them in that moment. No, you have to be more compassionate, you have to be more considerate. We all go through ups and downs in life. But if we discuss the norm in our religion, that norm is unequivocal. And some people misplace the healthy bond that we have with people in the ummah and people that we share with faith, which is a very normal and healthy part. And has some special things like zakah is not applied to non-Muslims, etc., etc. But many of the Islamic norms and so on extend to all humanity. And we're going to talk about neighbors. I'm not going to condition it to your Muslim neighbors, because the Hadith doesn't do that. Your guests, it's not conditioned to your Muslim guests. So we should also be fair to the tradition in that regard. Excellent. Jazakumullah khairan. Next hadith, next time inshallah, next week. Start with hadith number 14. One of the most often misunderstood and most commonly FAQ hadith, if you will, because it has to do with sociology, politics. We'll start with that inshallah, and then talk about some hadith about Islamic manners and anger inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. We'll see you next time inshallah. If you haven't marked the attendance sheet, make sure you do that inshallah. It's up here in the front.